Welcome to Communicative Language Teaching and Reactions to it. My name is Brian Portilla and I will walk you through some positive reactions towards this set of teaching practices that we call communicative language teaching. For starters, we need to review that communicative language teaching is a group of teaching methodologies that teachers have developed around the idea of communication and having the student at the center of the language practice or the teaching practice that we do. So, communicative language teaching is a reaction to the contextual situations in which it emerged. Back in the 1960s, when there was a shift in the way the view of the language was perceived, we moved from a structural perspective to a more functional and even an interactional perspective. In that way, teachers started to have classroom practices that were aiming at helping students develop their communicative competence. This was very positive because in the past the structural view was only about using the language for the purposes of studying only the languages but not communicating. Also, an impact that happened during this time or that helped the communicative language teaching practices to appear was that communication advances and progresses were bigger, and there was a little bit of a disappearance of the geographical boundaries that allowed more and more interaction among people around the globe. The principles of communication or communicative language teaching are all a collective construction from different authors, pedagogists, didactic practitioners, and of course English teachers around the world. This reflection about how to allow communication brought a moment in which everybody started talking and discussing about how to help students achieve or develop their communication skills, which is why different authors started to provide different input in order to put together what we call communicative language teaching now. This set of teaching practices are usually or mostly based on language acquisition, as they seek to help or replicate the natural processes of communication. Communicative language teaching entails different perceptions of language. Of course, language is meaning that is negotiated, is meaning that we make out of the world, of the semantic world in which we are, and this language is learned to communicate. This perception of the language is also connected to the idea of trial and error and how students are allowed to make mistakes, discover the language just as in the natural process of communication. Language is also fluency and is also accuracy, and of course it is contextually judged. There is a great impact on how language is viewed, not only as accuracy as it was in the structural view, but fluency as well, and this combination should be in balance. Communicative language teaching entails different competencies. This sociolinguistic competence, grammatical competence, strategic competence, discursive and intercultural competence are all together forming what we call the communicative competence. This is to say that the communicative competence is a multi-competence or multi-componential construct in which we have different specific competencies that help the student effectively communicate. We should understand the sociolinguistic competence as all the knowledge that we need to have about the language in order to understand who my interlocutor is and the context in which I am using the language. The grammatical competence, some authors like Chomsky called it grammatical, but then other authors like Swain indicate that this is called the linguistic competence. This linguistic competence is the knowledge that we have about the language itself or the structures or the formal aspects of the language in order to communicate. The strategic competence is the knowledge that we need to have about the language in order to solve the problems of communications that we may have. Moments in which we don't know the words, the expressions, moments in which we need to use one specific expression in this specific context and not in another. The discursive competence at the core of all the competencies is related to the idea of knowing how to produce general ideas, how to be able to express meaning through discourse and speech rather than just through vocabulary or grammar or little expressions. It's more about being able to communicate in big general ideas or specific ideas, but as a discourse itself. And the intercultural competence is understanding that my interlocutor has a specific cultural background that may impede or may facilitate my communication with him if I know how to use the language to effectively understand who this person is and how this person and his background relates to my own background. So, the communicative language teaching that aims at the development of the communicative competence focuses its attention on the development of these different competencies, and they all form the communicative competence. The syllabi, the goals and objectives, activities and techniques all reflect and respond to the students' needs, interests, and context. This is understood as one of the most important benefits or characteristics of the communicative language teaching, because we are paying attention that the student is the center of the teaching practice, and we are paying attention to what they require, what they need, what they like, and how the context in which they revolve really needs to connect to the development of their skills. CLT, or this communicative language teaching, doesn't provide specific rules for implementation, which is good. It gives the teachers the flexibility to interpret the principles of communication and develop teaching practices, classroom activities, and strategies that favor the student, but there is not a strict way of doing this. That's why we have many different methodologies. That's why we have flipped learning. We have project-based learning, content-based learning. We have many different teaching practices that definitely give the teacher the flexibility to explore language teaching, always considering the principles of communication established in the initial communicative approach. Communicative language teaching allows scaffolding of content, of skills at different paces, stances, and contexts. This scaffolding, this development of students' competencies can happen at different paces. So the syllabi that we are proposed can be moved from a specific number of hours, a specific number of classes in specific different periods of time for short, long periods of time. This pace is something that allows a flexibility, and it is actually a very positive benefit. It's a benefit that it brings to the teaching practices that we have. The role of the learning and the learner is basically autonomous. The learning relies always on the student, and this gives the teacher a position of the guide, a position of a facilitator, rather than a person that is guiding the teaching practices by having strong interventions in the activities, for example. The teacher is an entity that is autonomous. So teachers' autonomous decision making is always important. In communicative language teaching, the teacher is the one who is giving the role of pedagogical expert, making the decisions about what is it that benefits the most to students, the type of activities that are brought, the type of materials that are brought, the learning context and the learning conditions that are established by the teachers are respected and understood, as the teacher is the one who knows about the principles of communication and having the student as the center of the teaching practice, which is why the teacher is a critical pedagogist who makes informed decisions. Communicative language teaching facilitates shared communicative failure or success. Understanding that the student communicates in a context with a group of people in a community, then the failure to communicate can happen both at the individual level. A student may fail to communicate the message that he wants to have, but this message is part of an interaction, and this interaction may also fail, and this is why it's a collective or shared failure or success. Communicative language teaching shows integration of language skills. As we mentioned before, there is a natural replication of the process of communication or the desired type of communication, and this happens only when the skills are integrated, when one skill is the input for the other one, when my reading activity is necessary for the students to be able to talk about a specific topic. This integration of the skills is a strong view of communicative language teaching that happens in the different methodologies implemented by the teacher under this umbrella of teaching practices. Communicative language teaching can be viewed from different teaching perspectives or foci, which have the learner at the center of the practices. If you focus your attention in the input during your teaching practices, then you would have something like context-based learning. If you pay attention to the outcome, we have a competency-based learning. If we pay attention to the process of learning as a stronger way during the teaching practice, we have task-based learning or project-based learning. And if you pay attention to learning differences, we have multiple intelligences. This indicates that communicative language teaching helps you innovate the teaching practices. In your own search as a teacher, or even as institutions, searching for ways to having students be effective communicators has allowed that teachers innovate in the teaching practices, that they adapt what they currently have, that they moved from the face-to-face classes to the virtual environments where they have this type of teaching practice, but they incorporate new steps so they benefit the student and their communication process. This innovation is a strong positive component of communicative language teaching. And that's why right now we have many different methodologies that go under the umbrella of communication or communicative language teaching. With this, we are going to stop this first part and think that the benefits of communicative language teaching are big, and they positively impact the ways in which we are conducting or reflecting about our approaches, and of course the visions of language and the vision of communication that we should have with our students in the institutions where we work. Thank you.